I am Lord Briggs. This is the judgment summary in Evergreen Marine UK Limited and Nautical Challenge Limited. This appeal is about a collision at sea. It is the first collision case to come before this court or its predecessor, the House of Lords, for nearly 50 years. Collisions at sea are avoided all round the world by mariners complying with an international convention called the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea, the Collision Regulations for short. The collision regulations have been developed and refined over more than a century to enable vessels of all shapes and sizes, from small dinghies to the largest supertankers, under sail or power, when approaching each other with a risk of collision, to know what to do to prevent that risk becoming a reality. The UK courts have had and continue to have a major but not exclusive role in the interpretation of the collision regulations. The court's task is usually to decide which of two ships is at fault when a collision between them has caused damage to one, or usually to both, or injury or loss of life to their crews and any passengers, so that fair compensation may be paid by the owners or insurers of the ship or ships at fault. In the present case, both ships were gravely damaged, but there was, mercifully, no loss of life. Consistent interpretation of the collision regulations by the courts also serves to strengthen their effect in preventing collisions from occurring in the first place. Ambiguities in the rules may mean that mariners lack the clear guidance they need to avoid collisions when the risk arises. The UK courts typically seek the advice of experienced mariners to assist them in deciding what may be difficult questions about seafaring. The present case is no exception. Both this court and the courts below have been advised on matters of seamanship by highly experienced nautical assessors. They are usually selected from among the elder brethren of Trinity House, the ancient organisation which, among other things, maintains the lights, buoys and navigation marks which ensure safe navigation in our coastal waters. Nonetheless, the interpretation of the collision regulations is ultimately a matter of law for the judges rather than the nautical assessors to decide. There are three groups of rules which mainly govern power-driven vessels when they are in sight of each other. First, if they're approaching each other head-on, they must each turn to starboard, i.e. to the right. Secondly, if one is overtaking the other, she must keep well clear of the vessel she is overtaking. Thirdly, if two vessels are crossing with a risk of collision, then firstly, the vessel which has the other on her starboard side, that's the give-way vessel, must take early action to keep well clear, while secondly, the other vessel, that's the stand-on vessel, must keep her course and speed, at least until action by both vessels is required to avoid a collision. These two rules are known as the crossing rules, and their interpretation lies at the heart of this appeal. The collision in this case took place at night, but in clear visibility, just outside the outer limit of a narrow channel leading to the port of Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates. A large tanker, the ALEXANDRA I, was slowly approaching from seaward along a rather irregular course, waiting to pick up her pilot, while a large container ship, the Eversmart, was proceeding out of Jebel Ali on a steady course down the narrow channel at a much faster speed. ALEXANDRA had Eversmart on her starboard side. If the crossing rules applied, ALEXANDRA was therefore the give-way vessel. Despite the irregularities in ALEXANDRA's course and the changing speeds of both vessels, the two ships remained on a steady compass bearing of each other for the whole of the 23-minute period before the collision. The regulations and the reported decisions of the courts, as well as the advice of the nautical assessors, all make it clear that the approach of another vessel on a steady compass bearing is the surest sign that there is a risk of collision. The compass bearing of an approaching vessel may easily be measured by day or by night, by radar, or by the use of a compass. The trial judge found that the two main reasons for the collision were that those navigating Eversmart failed to keep a good visual lookout, so that they only sighted Alexandra at the last moment, while those navigating Alexandra failed to keep a good audio lookout, and therefore misinterpreted a radio message from the port control, so that they thought, wrongly, that Eversmart had been ordered to pass behind Alexandra's stern. Both were therefore to blame for the collision. The owners of Eversmart had alleged that the crossing rules applied, so that Alexandra should have kept well clear of her. But the judge decided that, although the two ships were crossing on a steady compass bearing, and therefore with a risk of collision, nonetheless the crossing rules did not apply. This was for two reasons. First, the Alexandra was not on a steady course, although Eversmart was. And second, the crossing rules were overridden by the narrow channel rule. This is a rule which requires vessels navigating in a narrow channel each to keep on their starboard side of it. The Court of Appeal agreed unanimously with the judge and dismissed Eversmart's owner's appeal. On their further appeal, this court has decided, unanimously, that the crossing rules did apply to the encounter between the two ships, so that Alexandra should have kept well clear of Eversmart. The appeal is therefore allowed. Lord Hamblin and I jointly give the judgment, with which Lord Lloyd-Jones, Lady Arden, and Lord Barrows agree. I will briefly explain our reasons. First, where two approaching vessels are crossing on a steady compass bearing, and therefore with a risk of collision, there is no requirement in the collision regulations that the give-way vessel, which has the other ship on her starboard side, should also be on a steady course before the crossing rules apply to both of them. Although there are reported cases which have been interpreted by some as meaning that at least the other vessel, that's the stand-on vessel, must first be on a steady course, the collision regulations do not make it a condition for the application of the crossing rules that either should first be on a steady course. Such a condition would stand in the way of the preeminence and clear guidance given by the crossing rules once approaching vessels which are crossing are, because of their steady compass bearings, at clear risk of collision. While it is usually easy to see whether another approaching vessel is on a steady compass bearing, it is not always so easy to see whether she is on a steady course, and the crossing rules should always be strictly applied where possible, because they tend to secure safe navigation. Secondly, while the narrow channel rule will usually displace the crossing rules once two vessels are both navigating in opposite directions within the confines of a narrow channel, the position is more difficult when one is in the channel while the other is only approaching it. Contrary to the view of the courts below, it is not enough that the vessel approaching the narrow channel is waiting or intending to enter it. It is only when the approaching vessel is shaping her course to take her to the starboard side of the narrow channel on her final approach that the crossing rules are displaced. Both reasons given by the courts below for the non-application of the crossing rules had the effect of downgrading the crossing rules from their essential function in preventing a risk of collision from becoming a reality, and created a gap in the protection provided by the collision regulations, where a clearly observable risk of collision existed. Nor could the principles of good seamanship satisfactorily fill that gap, because, without a rule clearly providing what both vessels must do, each vessel would be hampered in her efforts to avoid a collision by uncertainty as to what the other vessel would be likely to do. Applied to the facts of this case, Alexandra and Eversmart were approaching each other, crossing on steady compass bearings for a substantial period of time, with a clear risk of collision. Alexandra was moving, but waiting to pick up her pilot before entering the narrow channel. She was not on her final approach or shaping her course to the starboard side of the channel. The crossing rules therefore applied, and since she had Eversmart on her starboard side and was therefore the give-way vessel, Alexandra should have kept well clear of her. That conclusion does not mean that Alexandra was solely responsible for the collision. The apportionment of blame must be carried out afresh by the Admiralty Court on a proper appreciation that the crossing rules apply to the collision. That is the end of this judgment summary, and the court is now adjourned.